En una de esas noches que parecían diseñadas para quedarse grabadas en la memoria, la ciudad de México vibraba con su ritmo único. John Miller sat on his porch. Las luces de paseo de la Reforma iluminaban el asfalto como estrellas caídas, mientras el eco de los claxones se mezclaba con el murmullo de la gente que caminaba entre cafés, bares y galerías. Quiet, heavy, and lonely. He lived in the countryside, away from the bustle of town, where the silence of the fields pressed in like a blanket he could never quite shake off. His solitude was familiar. After 2 tours in the Marines, he had returned to American soil with scars that didn't show in mirrors, but gnawed at him daily. Nights were restless and days often stretched long and hollow. He had gotten used to being alone, though not at peace with it. But that evening something broke the routine. A faint rustle at the edge of his yard drew his attention. At first he thought it was a deer, but the movement was too uneven, too fragile. Then he saw it, a German shepherd, gaunt and staggering, each rib visible beneath its patchy fur. The animal's legs trembled with every step, until finally it collapsed at the foot of his porch, chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate breaths. John froze, heart clenching at the sight. Memories rushed back in an instant, images of military dogs patrolling dusty roads overseas, eyes sharp, bodies disciplined, always standing guard for men like him. He blinked, reality sinking in. This dog wasn't a soldier anymore. This dog was broken, starving, and had chosen his doorstep as its last refuge. The silence between them was only broken by the faint whimper from the shepherd. John's throat tightened. He hadn't felt needed in years, but now, in the stillness of his porch, something raw and urgent tugged at him. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this, real journeys of survival, loyalty, and redemption that touch the heart. He rose from his chair and knelt beside the collapsed dog. Its fur was coarse, its paws cracked from miles of wandering. The animal's eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, still held a glimmer of awareness. John extended his hand slowly, speaking softly, almost in a whisper. "Easy, boy, you're safe here." The shepherd lifted its head weakly, then let it drop again, too drained to respond. John's mind raced. He wasn't prepared for this. He barely kept himself together most days. How could he possibly take care of a dog this broken? Yet walking away was not an option. Not for him. Not after everything he had seen. He stood and pushed the door open. "Come on," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "Let's get you out of the dirt." With careful arms, he lifted the limp body. The shepherd was lighter than he expected, shockingly so, the weight of neglect pressing against his chest as he carried it inside. The old screen door slammed shut behind him, and the stillness of his modest home wrapped around them both. John laid the dog on an old quilt in the corner of the living room, his hands moving instinctively to fetch water from the kitchen. He filled a shallow bowl and set it down. The shepherd's tongue flicked weakly at the water, drinking just enough to wet its mouth before collapsing again. John sat on the floor beside him, running a hand down the dog's back, feeling every ridge of bone. His jaw clenched. Somewhere inside, he knew this was not just about feeding a stray. This was about responsibility, about the kind of duty that never really leaves a man, no matter how long ago he hung up the uniform. The evening light dimmed into night, shadows stretching across the room. John leaned against the wall, watching the shepherd breathe, fragile but alive. He didn't have answers, not about money, not about long-term care, not about anything beyond tonight. But for now, the choice was simple. "You'll make it through the night," he whispered, as if promising it to himself as much as to the dog. The house, once so empty, now carried the quiet rhythm of 2 survivors bound by chance, and neither knew it yet. But this night was only the beginning. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the fragile sound of the shepherd's breathing from the corner. John sat at his kitchen table, staring at the dog stretched out on the old quilt. His coffee had gone cold in his hands, forgotten. The reality of the situation pressed heavier with each passing minute. He hadn't invited this animal into his life, yet it lay there as if it belonged. The shepherd stirred, opening its eyes just enough to glance at him. There was no strength behind the gaze, only a desperate kind of trust. John shifted uncomfortably. He had spent years avoiding attachments, keeping the world at arm's length. Now here was this broken creature, and he felt something he hadn't in a long time: responsibility. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, setting the mug down with a dull thud. The refrigerator door squeaked as he opened it. Inside, not much: half a loaf of bread, some eggs, and leftover chicken from the night before. He pulled the chicken out, cutting it into small pieces and placing them in a shallow dish. When he set it on the floor, the shepherd sniffed it weakly, then nudged forward, eating in small, cautious bites. Watching the dog eat stirred something deep within John. He knew enough to recognize that hunger wasn't the only issue here. Malnutrition, dehydration, maybe infection. The list of potential problems spun in his head, and with it came the inevitable question: could he afford this? He leaned back against the counter, rubbing the back of his neck. His disability check covered just enough for bills and food, with a little left for gas and odds and ends. A dog meant vet bills, medication, and food that didn't come cheap. Still, when the shepherd finished the chicken and lifted its head, licking its dry lips before resting again, John felt the answer pull at him. The animal had come to his door. Walked who knows how far to collapse here. That wasn't something you ignored. He crouched beside the quilt once more. "I don't know what kind of trouble you've been through, buddy, but you picked the wrong guy if you're looking for someone who's got it all together." His voice cracked with honesty. "I can barely take care of myself." The shepherd shifted, letting out a low sigh as if to disagree. John chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "Figures. You look like hell, and somehow you still managed to make me feel guilty." The truth was, guilt wasn't new to him. He had carried it since his deployment. Men lost, choices made in split seconds that could never be undone. He lived with it, but seeing this dog stretched out on the floor stirred a familiar instinct he thought had been buried with his uniform: the instinct to protect. The night dragged on. He tried to distract himself with the TV, flipping through channels, but his eyes kept drifting back to the quilt. Every rise and fall of the shepherd's chest became a quiet reminder of the fragile line between survival and surrender. By the time the clock struck midnight, John had made his decision. Not a long-term promise, not a plan for the future, just a choice for now. He would keep the dog alive tonight. Tomorrow could wait. He brought another small bowl of water, kneeling as the shepherd lapped at it slowly. His rough hand brushed over the animal's ear. "We'll figure this out in the morning," he whispered. "For tonight, you're safe here." The words echoed through the quiet house, heavier than he intended. For years, his home had been a place of isolation, a space where walls held back ghosts he couldn't face. Now, for the first time, it felt different. Warmer, less empty. He lay back in his chair, eyes growing heavy, listening to the steady rhythm of the shepherd's breathing. In that fragile sound, he found something he hadn't felt in a long while: the hint of purpose. And though doubts about money, responsibility, and the future still lingered, one thing was certain: John Miller, against every instinct to stay detached, had taken his first step toward a decision that would change everything. The next morning broke with pale light filtering through John's curtains, the kind of grey dawn that felt undecided, neither promising sunshine nor rain. He rubbed the fatigue from his eyes, his body stiff from a restless night on the chair. The first thing he noticed wasn't the ache in his back, but the steady sound of breathing from the corner. The shepherd was still alive. John pushed himself to his feet, walking over quietly. The dog raised its head slightly, ears twitching at his approach. That small gesture of alertness made something tighten in John's chest. Survival was still possible. "Morning," he said softly, crouching down. "Looks like you're not giving up on me yet." The shepherd licked its lips, nudging toward the empty dish. John frowned, knowing scraps from his fridge wouldn't be enough this time. If he was serious about giving the animal a chance, it meant more than water and leftovers. It meant a vet. The thought hit him like a weight. Money. Bills. The last thing his budget could handle was expensive treatment. He rubbed the back of his neck, pacing the room. He could talk himself out of it, pretend he had done all he could. But then the shepherd tried to sit up, wobbling on weak legs before collapsing again, and the argument inside him ended. An hour later, his old pickup truck rattled down the 2-lane road toward Raleigh. The shepherd lay on a blanket in the passenger seat, too weak to protest. John kept one hand on the wheel and the other close, steadying the dog when it shifted. Every bump in the road sent a jolt through his nerves. "Hang on, Ranger," he muttered instinctively, though he hadn't given the dog a name yet. The words slipped out unplanned, surprising even him. By the time he pulled into the parking lot of Carter Veterinary Clinic, his jaw was clenched tight. The clinic was modest, with a white-painted exterior and a neat little sign with blue lettering. He parked and carried the shepherd inside, the weight feeling heavier with each step, not because of the dog, but because of what it meant. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Oh my goodness, bring him right in." A few moments later, Dr. Emily Carter entered the exam room. She was in her 30s, with her dark hair tied back neatly and a calm, steady demeanor that put people at ease. She knelt beside the shepherd without hesitation, her hands moving with practiced care. "This boy's been through a lot," she murmured, checking his gums, ears, and paws. Her brow furrowed as she ran her hand gently down his side, pausing at the sight of scars and calluses. "See these? Training marks. He's not just any stray." John's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "Looks like he's been a working dog. Maybe military, maybe police. He's disciplined, even in the way he reacts." She glanced up at him. "He's tough, but he's also dangerously underweight, dehydrated and weak. We'll need blood work, fluids and medication." John swallowed hard. He could already see dollar signs flashing before her words even finished. "How much is this going to cost?" Emily paused, reading his expression. She had seen it before, people torn between compassion and empty wallets. "I'll do what I can to keep the costs manageable. He deserves a chance." John nodded, though his throat was dry. "Do what you need to. I'll figure the rest out." As she prepared an IV, he stood back, watching the shepherd's body tremble slightly as the fluids entered. For a moment, his mind slipped away, back to dusty roads overseas, where he had watched medics fight for his brothers in arms. The same determination he had seen then was now reflected in this vet, fighting for a life too many would have walked away from. When the exam was done, Emily turned to him. "He's got a tough road ahead, but if he pulls through, he'll be loyal to the end. Dogs like him don't forget kindness." John looked down at the shepherd lying on the table, eyes half open but alive. He felt the truth of her words sink into him. Loyalty. That was something he understood. Driving home later, the dog resting beside him once more, John knew he had crossed a line. There was no turning back. The decision wasn't temporary anymore. It was becoming something permanent. And that permanence, though frightening, carried a weight that felt strangely right. The days that followed the vet visit felt strangely different in John's quiet house. He kept the shepherd close, making sure the medications were given on time, watching as the animal regained small traces of strength. Each day the dog held its head a little higher, and each night its breathing grew steadier. The improvement wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to stir something restless inside John. He had thought caring for the animal would feel like a burden. Instead, it felt almost natural, as though the rhythm of feeding, watering, and monitoring gave his own life a structure he hadn't realized was missing. Still, there was something about this dog that unsettled him. Not in a bad way, but in a way that pulled memories to the surface he had tried for years to bury. One evening, John sat on the floor near the quilt, while the shepherd rested. He absent-mindedly tapped his fingers against his thigh, a habit from his service days. To his surprise, the dog lifted its head, ears twitching, and sat upright. John raised an eyebrow. "You responding to that?" he asked quietly. He tapped again, this time more deliberately. The shepherd shifted, almost as if awaiting a command. Intrigued, John leaned forward. "Sit." The dog lowered onto its haunches instantly, though its body still trembled with weakness. John's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't trained it, hadn't said those words before. This wasn't coincidence. He tried again, voice steady. "Stay." The shepherd froze, gaze locked on him with a focus that was eerily familiar. John's chest tightened. He had seen that look before. The razor-sharp discipline of working dogs in the field, eyes trained to read their handler's every move. His hand trembled as he whispered, almost to himself, "You're not just some stray, are you?" The shepherd tilted its head, panting lightly, waiting for his next move. John swallowed hard, memories surging uninvited. He remembered the desert sun burning down on his unit, the barking of military canines as they scouted ahead for danger, the way handlers spoke to their dogs in clipped, commanding tones. He remembered the bond, unshakable, forged in fire and trust, and he remembered the day his unit lost theirs. The image hit him like a blow, smoke rising, shouts ringing in his ears, and the silence that followed when the dust cleared. That dog hadn't made it home. Neither had some of the men. John pressed his palms to his eyes, forcing the memories back down. But they clung to him, raw and jagged, as though this shepherd had unlocked a door he'd nailed shut long ago. The animal in front of him barked once, sharp but not aggressive, almost as if sensing his turmoil. John dropped his hands and looked at it, meeting its steady gaze. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not by a person, but by a creature who understood discipline, survival, and loss. He leaned closer, his voice low. "You've been through hell too, haven't you?" The shepherd didn't answer, of course, but the way it stayed rooted in place, attentive and calm, was enough. Later that night, as thunder rumbled distantly, John noticed the shepherd flinch, its body tensing. The sudden tremor mirrored his own reaction. His chest tightened, palms sweating as the storm cracked overhead. The dog curled against the wall, whimpering softly, while John sat nearby, breathing unevenly. For a long time they stayed like that, two survivors weathering more than just a storm. The parallel was undeniable. Both bore scars that no one else could see, scars that surfaced when the world outside grew loud. By the time the storm passed, John found himself sitting on the floor with the shepherd leaning into his leg, trembling, easing with every minute. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. The silence between them was heavy, meaningful, and filled with recognition. Something had shifted. The shepherd wasn't just a responsibility anymore. It was a mirror, a reflection of everything John had endured, everything he had tried to forget. And though he didn't want to admit it out loud, part of him already knew. This dog might be the key to facing the past he had been running from for far too long. By the end of the week, the shepherd had begun to show signs of true recovery. His ribs still pressed against his skin, but his steps were steadier, his eyes brighter. John caught himself watching the dog more often than he admitted, surprised by how much space the animal had already claimed in his life. He hadn't yet given him a name. That detail hung in the air like unfinished business, gnawing at John every time he called out a clumsy, "Hey, boy," or "Come here." It didn't feel right. This dog had endured too much to remain nameless, yet no word seemed to fit. That afternoon, John sat on the porch, the shepherd curled beside his boots. A breeze stirred the tall grass in the field across the road, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and earth. He reached down absently, scratching the rough fur behind the shepherd's ears. "You need a name," John murmured. The dog tilted his head, ears flicking at the sound of his voice. "Can't just keep calling you dog. You deserve better than that." He tried a few names out loud, Max, Duke, Shadow, but none of them landed. Each felt borrowed, as though it belonged to someone else's story. The shepherd gave no reaction, only blinking patiently at him, which somehow made John chuckle. "You're stubborn, huh?" "Just gonna wait until I get it right." Later, while fixing himself dinner, the words slipped out again, unplanned. He had dropped a plate on the counter too loudly, and the shepherd immediately sat at attention, eyes sharp, body tense. The response was automatic, disciplined. "Ranger," John whispered, the name tumbling from his mouth without thought. His chest tightened at the sound of it. The dog didn't move, but something about the moment felt right, like a memory clicking into place. He crouched, repeating it more firmly. "Ranger." This time the shepherd's ears perked. his gaze locked onto John's, steady and alert, as if claiming the name for himself. John felt a rush of warmth in his chest, almost overwhelming. "Well, there it is," he said softly, running his hand along the shepherd's neck. "Ranger, that's you." The word carried weight. For John, it wasn't just a name. It was a reminder of his own past, of men who had stood beside him, of duty and loyalty that didn't fade with time. By naming the shepherd, he was acknowledging something deeper. This dog wasn't just passing through. He was becoming part of John's life. Over the next few days, the bond grew stronger. Ranger followed John from room to room, padding quietly across the wooden floor, never straying far. When John brewed coffee in the morning, Ranger sat by his side. When John worked in the yard, Ranger lay in the shade nearby, watching. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. It carried the sound of nails clicking against wood, of quiet breathing at night, of companionship John hadn't realized he craved. He began talking to Ranger more, words flowing easier than they did with people. Over coffee, he'd mutter about his plans for the day. At night, he found himself voicing thoughts he usually kept buried. "How you know?" John said one evening, leaning back in his chair while Ranger sprawled at his feet. "I didn't think I had room left for anyone. Thought maybe I was meant to just get through my days one at a time until they were gone." He paused, his throat tightening. "But you're changing that." "Damn dog, you're changing everything." Ranger shifted, resting his head against John's boot as if in agreement. The simple gesture broke through John's defenses in a way nothing else had. Naming him had sealed it. Ranger wasn't just a guest anymore. He was family. And with that realization came a flicker of hope, fragile but real, that perhaps the two of them, scarred as they were, could build something together neither had expected to find. The first real test came on a stormy night. The sky had been grumbling since late afternoon, dark clouds rolling over the hills, carrying the weight of rain and thunder. John didn't think much of it at first. He'd weathered storms before. But as the night deepened and the sky split open with a violent crack, both man and dog were thrown back into places they didn't want to revisit. The thunder rattled the windows, a sharp boom echoing through the house. Ranger bolted upright, eyes wide, body trembling. He scrambled toward the corner, ears flat, tail tucked, whining in a low, panicked pitch. The sound tore at John, because he felt it too. His chest tightened, palms slick with sweat. He knew it wasn't rational, this was just weather, but the storm's violence mirrored the sounds of explosions from years ago. His body didn't care about the difference. He sank onto the edge of his bed, his breaths shallow, heart racing. For a moment the room felt like it was collapsing around him. He closed his eyes and saw flashes. Sand whipping across his face, the ground shaking beneath him, the roar of chaos swallowing every thought. His fists clenched, nails digging into his palms as he fought to anchor himself in the present. Then through the haze he heard it, Ranger's whine. Not just fear, but a call. John forced his eyes open. The shepherd was pressed against the wall, shaking violently, trapped in the same invisible war John was fighting. "Easy, Ranger," John whispered, his voice unsteady. He pushed himself off the bed, kneeling on the floor. "It's just a storm. You're all right." "We're all right." His hand reached out slowly, brushing the dog's fur. Ranger flinched at first, then leaned into the touch, pressing his head against John's shoulder. The trembling didn't stop immediately, but it eased, bit by bit, as John stroked his neck. "You're with me now," John murmured, though the words were as much for himself as for the dog. "You're safe." "We both are." The storm outside raged on, lightning flashing through the windows, thunder rolling like artillery. But in that small corner of the house, man and dog held each other through it. John felt something shift inside him. For years he had hidden his fear, letting it coil inside until it poisoned him. He never wanted anyone to see him this way, vulnerable, shaken, broken. But Ranger didn't judge. He didn't ask questions. He simply stayed, grounding John with his presence. When the storm finally began to fade, both were exhausted. John leaned back against the wall, Ranger curled tightly against him, their breathing gradually sinking. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was healing. Later, as John lay awake listening to the soft drip of rain on the roof, he realized the truth. They weren't just sharing a home. They were sharing their scars. Ranger's panic wasn't random. It came from battles fought before, just as John's did. They were reflections of each other. Two survivors bound not by chance but by recognition. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the kitchen in pale gold. John poured coffee, his body still weary, but his mind strangely lighter. Ranger sat at his feet, calm again, watching him with steady eyes. "You and me," John said quietly, glancing down. "Looks like we've both got some shadows to deal with." Ranger wagged his tail once, a small, deliberate gesture that felt like agreement. For the first time in a long while, John didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of his past alone. The shadows were still there, yes, but now there was someone walking beside him through them, and that, he realized, changed everything. By the time 2 weeks had passed, Ranger's frame had filled out enough that his ribs no longer stood out like ridges. His steps were stronger now, his coat beginning to shine again. For John, watching the transformation was equal parts pride and relief. But he also knew healing wasn't just about what happened inside the house. Ranger needed to see the world again. That morning, John clipped an old leash to Ranger's collar. The dog's ears flicked back, his body tensing as if he wasn't sure what was expected of him. John gave a reassuring pat. "Just a walk, buddy. Nothing to worry about." They started down the gravel driveway, the morning sun filtering through the oak trees. The air carried the scent of damp earth, a reminder of last night's rain. At first, Ranger walked stiffly, head low as though each step was measured against some hidden fear. John kept the pace slow, speaking gently when Ranger hesitated. "You're all right, just one step at a time." By the time they reached the edge of town, Ranger's stride had loosened, though his eyes scanned every sound and movement. The rustle of a passing car, the slam of a door, even the laughter of children playing nearby, all of it made him pause, body on alert. John recognized the instinct. It wasn't unlike his own hyper-awareness in crowded spaces. Main Street was quiet that morning, with a few shops open and townsfolk moving about their routines. The pair drew attention. A man in worn jeans looked up from his truck, nodding in approval, but others weren't so kind. "That dog looks rough," one woman muttered as she passed with her groceries. Her tone wasn't cruel, but it stung all the same. John's jaw tightened. "He's stronger than he looks," he said firmly, though the woman had already walked on. Ranger seemed to sense his tension. He pressed closer to John's side, eyes watchful. That small gesture steadied him. They stopped outside the hardware store, where an older man sitting on a bench gave Ranger a long look. "That shepherd's got spirit," he said, tipping his hat. "Takes grit to survive in that condition." John gave a small nod. "Yeah, he's tougher than most people realize." The man smiled faintly. "Sometimes folks don't see the fight still left in something, or someone." The words lingered as John continued the walk. It wasn't just about Ranger. It was about both of them. But the walk wasn't without struggle. When a sudden motorcycle roared down the street, Ranger froze, ears pinned, body rigid. His breathing quickened, eyes darting wildly. John crouched beside him, placing a firm hand on his chest. "Easy, Ranger, focus on me, just me." The shepherd's gaze flicked to him, trembling still in every limb, but anchored by the steady voice. John waited patiently until the panic eased, then rose slowly, guiding Ranger forward again. By the time they made the loop back toward home, both were tired. Ranger's stride was more confident than at the start, though he still cast wary glances at every sudden noise. For John, the exhaustion was familiar, the kind that came from pushing boundaries he'd long avoided. As they reached the driveway, he unclipped the leash and watched Ranger trot toward the porch, tail swaying lightly. It was subtle, but it was progress. John sank into his porch chair, catching his breath. Ranger sat beside him, panting softly, eyes calmer now. "You did good today," John said quietly. "We both did." The shepherd leaned against his leg, warm and solid. For the first time, John allowed himself a small smile. It hadn't been easy, and it wouldn't get easier overnight. But today proved something important. Step by step, they could face the world together. The next few weeks brought a rhythm that John hadn't felt in years. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, Ranger stretched out at his feet, ears twitching at the sounds of the waking countryside. Walks became part of their routine, each one a little easier than the last. And though the scars of past storms still lingered in both of them, they were learning to breathe through them together. But it was the neighbors who noticed first. Mrs. Turner, the elderly widow who lived 2 houses down, stopped by one afternoon with a plate of cornbread wrapped neatly in foil. She stood on the porch, smiling warmly as Ranger peered out from behind John's leg. "Well, isn't he handsome?" she said, her voice carrying that gentle southern drawl. "I saw you walking him through town last week. Folks are talking, you know." John raised an eyebrow, uneasy. "Talking? Don't you worry," she chuckled. "Mostly good things. Some folks said he looked rough, sure, but they also said you've been taking good care of him." People notice these things. John shifted, uncomfortable with the attention. He wasn't used to being noticed for much of anything. He needed help, that's all. Mrs. Turner patted his arm kindly. Sometimes, helping someone or something ends up helping you more than you realize. Her words lingered after she left, the scent of warm cornbread filling the kitchen. Over the days that followed, more neighbors began to reach out. A boy from up the street biked over with a bag of dog treats, shyly asking if he could pet Ranger. A man from the hardware store dropped off a sack of dog food, insisting it was extra stock he couldn't sell. Each gesture caught John off guard, chipping away at the walls he had built around himself. At first he resisted. Accepting help had never come easy, but as the offers continued, he realized it wasn't pity, it was community. And slowly, he let it in. One Saturday morning, he found himself at the local farmer's market with Ranger trotting beside him. The air buzzed with chatter, the scent of fresh bread and fried dough drifting between stalls. Ranger drew attention, his coat healthier now, his posture proud despite his past. "Is that the shepherd you rescued?" a vendor asked, handing John a small bag of apples. "Guess you could call it that," John replied, scratching Ranger's neck. "Well, you've done right by him. Looks like he's come back to life." John glanced at Ranger, who wagged his tail lightly at the sound of voices around him. He felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. It wasn't just Ranger who was coming back to life. Still, there were struggles. A loud noise from a nearby stall sent Ranger crouching low, eyes wide. John knelt immediately, grounding him with a hand on his shoulder, murmuring steady reassurance. A few people stared, whispers passing through the crowd, but others smiled encouragingly, nodding as if to say they understood. On the way home, John walked a little taller. The town's reaction no longer felt like judgment. It felt like support. Ranger wasn't just his dog anymore. He was becoming part of something larger, drawing John into connections he hadn't sought but clearly needed. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the crickets began their steady chorus, John sat on the porch again. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on his boots, eyes half closed in contentment. John thought of Mrs. Turner's words, of the boy's smile, of the quiet nods at the market. He had spent years keeping people at a distance, convinced he was safer alone. Yet here he was, pulled into the current of a small-town community, not by choice but by the loyalty of a dog who had collapsed at his door. John exhaled, feeling a weight lift he hadn't known he was carrying. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had always believed. It was on an ordinary morning that John began to notice something unusual. The sun had just lifted over the pines, painting the yard in golden light, when he tossed a stick across the grass without much thought. Ranger darted after it, but what caught John off guard wasn't the run. It was the precise, almost military way Ranger returned, circling wide before dropping the stick neatly at his feet. John raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't luck, was it?" Ranger sat, eyes locked on him, body still and attentive. It wasn't the casual obedience of a pet. It was the focus of a dog trained to follow orders. Curiosity tugged at John. He tried again, this time pointing toward a fallen branch across the yard. "Fetch!" Ranger bolted forward instantly, grabbing the branch and trotting back with the same practiced discipline. John's heart skipped. This wasn't coincidence. "You've been trained," he whispered. The realization brought with it a flood of memories. He had seen dogs like this in service, canines trained for precision, loyalty, and duty. Watching Ranger stirred something deep inside him, a mixture of admiration and sorrow. Someone had once relied on this dog the way he had relied on his brothers in arms. Over the next few days, John tested little things. A sharp whistle made Ranger snap to attention. A raised palm froze him mid-step. Even words John hadn't used in years, heel, stay, search, brought flickers of recognition in the shepherd's movements. It left John wondering who had trained this dog and what had happened to separate them. One evening, he brought it up to Mrs. Turner when she stopped by with more baked goods. She bent to scratch Ranger's head, smiling at the way he sat perfectly still at her command. "He listens better than most men I know," she laughed. John leaned against the porch railing, thoughtful. "This isn't just obedience. He's been through real training, police, maybe military." Mrs. Turner straightened, her expression softening. "Then he must have belonged to someone important once." The words echoed in John's head long after she left. Belonged. Ranger wasn't just a stray. He had a past, maybe even a family, though whether that family had abandoned him or lost him was a question that gnawed at John's mind. That night, sitting with Ranger by the fire, he voiced the thoughts aloud. "Where did you come from, huh? Who trained you? Who let you end up in the shape I found you?" His voice cracked, frustration bleeding into it. Ranger simply rested his head on John's knee, steady and calm, as if telling him the past didn't matter anymore. But for John, it did. He couldn't ignore the signs, not when every instinct told him this dog carried stories written in scars and discipline. And in some way he felt a responsibility to uncover them. The more he watched Ranger, the clearer it became. The shepherd wasn't just surviving, he was waiting, alert, ready, as though expecting a command that never came. John exhaled slowly, scratching behind his ears. "Whoever left you behind, they didn't deserve you." The fire crackled in the silence, and for the first time in years, John felt that old sense of duty flicker to life inside him. He had found a dog that had once been more than just a pet, and now maybe it was his turn to make sure Ranger never felt abandoned again. But in the back of his mind, a new question formed, one that refused to let him rest. If Ranger had once been part of something bigger, could John find out what or who had left him behind? The question of Ranger's past wouldn't leave John alone. Every precise movement, every sharp response to commands he hadn't taught, screamed of a history that someone had tried to erase. John felt it in his gut. This dog had once lived a life of purpose, and now he was left to wander, broken and forgotten. One evening, John sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open. He hadn't used it for much beyond paying bills and reading the news, but tonight he typed in a different kind of search: retired K9 German Shepherds in North Carolina. The results were endless, a mix of adoption agencies, old police records, and scattered stories of service dogs left behind after their duty ended. Hours passed. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room, his coffee growing cold as he dug deeper. He sent emails, filled out inquiry forms, even called a shelter 2 towns over. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a response. A woman from a rescue organization agreed to meet him. Her name was Carla, and she specialized in helping track down the backgrounds of working dogs who had been abandoned or misplaced. When she arrived at John's house, Ranger greeted her with cautious curiosity. She crouched low, letting him sniff her hand, then smiled knowingly. "He's definitely a former K9, she said. "Look at the way he scans the environment, always checking exits. That doesn't come from regular training." John leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed. "Any idea where he came from?" Carla pulled a tablet from her bag, flipping through files. "We'll have to run his microchip. If he was part of a unit, the records will tell us." It took only minutes. Ranger's chip number popped up, and Carla's face shifted as she scrolled. "Here he is. Registered as Ranger, Police K9 unit from Greensboro. He was active for 5 years, injured on duty, retired." John's chest tightened. "Retired?" Then how did he end up starving on my porch? Carla's voice softened. After retirement, the department tried to rehome him. The first family didn't keep him long. Too much responsibility, too many scars maybe. He bounced around a few times. Eventually he slipped through the cracks. John's fists clenched. Slipped through the cracks? After serving 5 years? Carla sighed, closing the file. It happens more than you'd think. Departments can't always take them back, and not every family understands what it means to care for a dog like this. John stared at Ranger, who sat patiently at his side, unaware of the story that had just been uncovered. His throat burned with anger. He gave everything, and they just let him end up like that. Carla placed a hand on his arm. What matters now is that he found you. Dogs like Ranger don't survive long on their own. The fact that he made it here says something. After she left, John stayed on the porch with Ranger, the autumn air crisp against his skin. He ran a hand down the shepherd's back, speaking softly. So, that's who you are. You carried a badge once. You served. And when you couldn't anymore, they gave up on you. His voice broke, raw with emotion. I know what that feels like. Ranger pressed against his leg, steady and loyal as ever. John exhaled slowly, the anger in his chest cooling into resolve. He didn't know if the department would ever come asking for Ranger, but he did know one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone take this dog from him now. For the first time in years, John felt certain about a decision. Ranger's service might have ended in neglect, but here in this small house at the edge of town, his second chapter was just beginning. John lay awake long after discovering the truth about Ranger's past. The knowledge gnawed at him. This dog had served, risked, and bled for others, only to be cast aside when his usefulness was gone. It struck too close to home. He knew the hollow ache of feeling discarded once the uniform came off. That night, staring at the ceiling, John made a decision. Ranger was his now, in every way that mattered. The next morning, Ranger padded into the kitchen, tail swaying gently. John set down a bowl of food, watching as the shepherd ate with calm confidence. No longer frantic, no longer desperate. He was beginning to trust that meals would always be there, that safety wasn't temporary. From now on, you're not going anywhere, John said firmly. Ranger paused mid-bite, glanced up at him, and gave a short, approving wag. It was enough to seal the promise. Over the weeks that followed, their bond deepened in ways John hadn't expected. Ranger seemed to sense when John's mind slipped into darker places. On nights when nightmares dragged him back into desert chaos, Ranger would nudge him awake before the panic took over. During the day, when John's chest tightened and the world felt too loud, Ranger pressed close, grounding him with steady warmth. One afternoon, John sat on the porch, lost in thought. Ranger came over and dropped a stick at his feet. John frowned. You're the one supposed to bring me out of my head, huh? He tossed the stick, and Ranger bounded after it, moving with surprising energy. When the shepherd returned, dropping it precisely where he had before, John couldn't help but laugh. Persistent, aren't you? It became their ritual. Whenever John drifted too far into silence, Ranger interrupted, demanding movement, reminding him that life was still happening around them. Dr. Emily noticed the change too. During a follow-up visit, she smiled as she examined Ranger's coat and weight. He looks like a different dog. Whatever you're doing, it's working. John scratched Ranger's ear. He's the one doing the work. I'm just keeping up. Emily tilted her head, studying John for a moment. Maybe he's doing the same for you. The words hit deeper than he let on. One evening, after a long walk, John sat in his armchair, Ranger curled nearby. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. He thought of the men he'd lost overseas, of the weight he still carried. For so long he had believed healing was out of reach, but looking at Ranger, breathing steadily at his feet, John realized something had shifted. You're saving me, Ranger, he admitted softly. The shepherd lifted his head, ears twitching as if he understood. For years, John had fought against himself, against the silence, against the memories that refused to fade. But now, with Ranger beside him, he wasn't fighting alone. The town noticed too. People stopped him on walks, commenting on how much stronger the dog looked, how steady he seemed. Some even remarked on John himself, how he seemed lighter, less closed off. He didn't know how to respond to that, but deep down he understood. Ranger wasn't just a second chance for himself. He was giving John one too. That night, as the crickets sang outside and the moonlight spilled across the room, John leaned down and pressed his forehead gently against Ranger's. "We're both still here," he whispered, "and as long as we've got each other, that's enough." The shepherd huffed softly, closing his eyes, content. For the first time in a long while, John believed it too. It was a chilly autumn night, when John's quiet life was interrupted. The wind carried the scent of smoke from chimneys, and the crunch of fallen leaves echoed beneath Ranger's paws as they returned from their evening walk. John locked the front door, hung his jacket, and settled into his chair with a sigh of contentment. Ranger curled at his feet, eyes half shut, ears flicking at every distant sound. The peace didn't last long. Around midnight, a faint noise stirred Ranger awake. His ears pricked, body tense, a low growl rising from his throat. John sat up immediately, the sound jolting him from the edge of sleep. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Ranger moved toward the door, posture rigid, eyes fixed. Then came the sound, soft but deliberate, the creak of a gate, footsteps where no footsteps should be. John's chest tightened. Out here, visitors didn't just show up unannounced at this hour. Before John could rise fully, a sharp knock rattled the back window. Ranger lunged, barking with a force that filled the house, deep and commanding. The noise outside stopped, but only for a moment. Another sound followed, the unmistakable jingle of a lock being tested. Adrenaline surged through John's veins. His military instincts came rushing back, uninvited but sharp. He grabbed the flashlight from the side table, his hand steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Stay close, Ranger," he murmured. The shepherd didn't need telling twice. They moved together, man and dog, toward the kitchen. A shadow loomed beyond the glass of the back door, shifting in the dim light. Ranger barked again, teeth bared, his body pressed against the door like a living barrier. "Who's there?" John called, voice hard. The shadow froze, then retreated quickly, disappearing into the darkness. Ranger's growls followed, echoing long after the footsteps faded. John exhaled slowly, tension loosening from his muscles. He crouched, placing a hand on Ranger's back. The dog was still trembling with energy, eyes sharp, body alert. "You did good," John said softly. "Real good." The next morning, John found faint scuff marks near the door and a broken piece of metal by the lock. Someone had tried to break in. The thought filled him with both anger and gratitude. Without Ranger, he might have been caught off guard. News spread quickly in the small town. At the hardware store, one of the clerks shook his head after hearing the story. "Guess folks will think twice before messing with you now. Word's out. You've got a guard who doesn't miss a thing." John nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "He's more than a guard. He's family." Mrs. Turner stopped by later that day with a basket of food, concern written on her face. "I heard what happened. Thank heavens you had Ranger." John glanced at the shepherd lying calmly on the porch, eyes scanning the yard. "Yeah, he's got my back. Always." That night, John sat by the fire, watching Ranger doze peacefully. His mind replayed the events, the way the dog had placed himself between danger and his home without hesitation. It wasn't just training, it was loyalty, pure and unshakable. Leaning forward, John spoke quietly. "You're more than I ever expected, Ranger. You're not just helping me get through the nights, you're protecting me in ways I didn't know I still needed." Ranger lifted his head at the sound of his name, tail thumping once against the floor before resting again. John let out a long breath, the firelight flickering across his face. For years he had felt unprotected, vulnerable against his own past and the world outside. But now, with Ranger by his side, he realized he wasn't alone in the fight anymore. The test had come sudden and unplanned, and Ranger had passed it without hesitation. The attempted break-in left John restless for days. Though nothing had been stolen, the incident stirred an unease he couldn't shake. Ranger's loyalty had proven itself beyond question, But the weight of being vulnerable again gnawed at John's mind. Nights grew longer, his thoughts drifting toward battles he thought he'd buried. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Ranger at his side, Mrs. Turner stopped by. She placed a warm casserole dish in his hands and lingered, studying him with kind but insistent eyes. "You know, John," she said gently, "we all carry things we can't handle alone. You've given Ranger a home, but maybe it's time you let someone help you too." John shifted uncomfortably. "I don't need—" She cut him off with a knowing smile. "I'm not talking about handouts. I'm talking about people who understand. There's a veterans group that meets at the community center. I think you and Ranger ought to come." John's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of sitting in a room with strangers, digging up the past, made his chest tighten. But later that night, when another nightmare jolted him awake and Ranger pressed close to calm him, her words echoed louder. The following week he found himself standing outside the brick community center, Ranger at his side. His palms were damp, his throat dry. The sounds of voices inside sent his heart racing. He almost turned back. But then Ranger nudged his hand, steady and grounding. John exhaled. "All right, boy. Let's give it a shot." Inside, a circle of men and women sat in folding chairs. Some wore old unit caps, others kept their heads bowed, but all carried the same heaviness in their posture. A tall man with a graying beard greeted him warmly. "First time?" John nodded. "Yeah, name's John." He motioned to the shepherd. "This is Ranger." The man smiled. "He's welcome too." Plenty of us know what it means to depend on a dog. As the meeting began, John stayed quiet, listening as others shared stories, memories of deployments, struggles with sleep, the loneliness of coming home to a world that felt foreign. Each story cut into him like a mirror. He wasn't alone in the things he carried. When the silence turned toward him, John hesitated. His throat tightened, words sticking. But then Ranger shifted, pressing against his leg. The warmth gave him the courage he needed. "I wasn't planning on talking," John began, his voice rough. "But I guess I should. I spent years trying to shut everything out. Lost men I should have brought home. Nights filled with noise that won't leave me even now. I thought maybe if I kept my distance from people, I wouldn't drag anyone else into it." He paused, glancing down at Ranger. "Then this dog showed up, half dead on my porch. I didn't save him. He saved me. And for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm drowning by myself." The room was quiet, but not in judgment. A few heads nodded, eyes glistening with understanding. The tall man spoke softly. "That's what we're here for, brother. To remind each other we're not carrying it alone." John's chest loosened in a way it hadn't in years. As the meeting wrapped up, several veterans approached to shake his hand, some kneeling to greet Ranger. The shepherd accepted their touch calmly, his eyes steady, as though he knew the weight of the moment. On the drive home, John rolled down the window, letting the cool night air wash over him. Ranger sat tall in the passenger seat, ears flicking at the sounds outside. "You were right," John said quietly. "I needed that. Guess I needed them." Ranger gave a soft huff in reply, and for once John felt the words in his chest lighten. The wounds of the past hadn't vanished, but they had been opened in a place where healing could begin. Winter crept in slowly, frosting the fields and leaving the mornings coated in silver. John wrapped his scarf tighter as he stepped outside, Ranger bounding into the yard with renewed energy. The shepherd's coat had grown thick and glossy, his movements confident and strong. Looking at him now, it was hard to believe he was the same starving animal who had collapsed on John's porch months ago. Life had settled into a rhythm, one that felt solid, dependable. John made it official. He registered Ranger as his service dog. The paperwork was straightforward, but the weight behind it was heavy. Ranger wasn't just a companion anymore. He was recognized as John's partner, his lifeline. At the veterans group, Ranger became a quiet fixture, lying faithfully at John's side while others spoke. The men and women there grew fond of him quickly. "That shepherd of yours has better discipline than most soldiers I knew," one veteran joked. John only smiled, pride shining in his eyes. But it wasn't just the group. Around town, Ranger was now greeted with smiles instead of whispers. The boy with the bike often rode past the house, waving eagerly to Ranger, who responded with a wagging tail. Mrs. Turner insisted on baking dog-friendly treats, delivering them in neat tins. Even the hardware store clerk set aside scraps of wood for John, suggesting he build a doghouse, though Ranger rarely left John's side long enough to need one. One Saturday, John found himself volunteering at the local shelter. It wasn't something he would have done before, but after seeing how far Ranger had come, he felt compelled to give back. Together, man and dog walked the rows of kennels, greeting anxious animals with patience. Ranger's calm presence seemed to ease even the most nervous strays, and John realized the healing they had found together was rippling outward. "You've got a gift," the shelter manager told him one day. "Dogs listen to you, they feel safe." John shook his head. "It's not me. It's him." He glanced at Ranger, who sat tall and watchful, eyes steady. "He's the one teaching me." At home, life grew richer in small ways. John started a garden in the spring, coaxing tomatoes and peppers from the soil, while Ranger trotted around the edges, chasing birds away from the plants. On quiet evenings, they walked down Main Street, pausing to talk with neighbors who once felt like strangers, but now greeted him with genuine warmth. The loneliness that had once weighed so heavily was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of companionship and community. Still, John didn't ignore the past. The scars, both his and Ranger's, were part of their story. But they were no longer chains. They were reminders of how far they had come. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, John leaned back in his chair, Ranger sprawled across the rug. He thought back to the first night, the fragile breaths, the ribs jutting out, the uncertainty of whether either of them could keep going. His chest tightened, but not from sorrow. This time, it was gratitude. "You saved me, Ranger," he said softly. The shepherd lifted his head, ears flicking at the sound of his name, before resting it back down with a contented sigh. For the first time in years, John felt his house wasn't just a place he lived in, it was a home built not on silence and shadows, but on loyalty, trust, and the kind of bond that asked for nothing and gave everything. It was a home for two survivors who had found each other in their lowest moments and risen stronger together. Spring brought with it the sound of life returning, the buzz of bees in blooming flowers, the smell of fresh-cut grass, and the warmth of longer days. John stood in his yard, Ranger trotting at his side, both of them stronger than they had been months ago. Looking back, he could hardly believe how far they had come since that fateful evening when a starving shepherd had collapsed on his porch. He remembered the ribs jutting through thin fur, the shallow breaths, the uncertainty of whether the dog would make it through the night, and he remembered his own silence back then, the weight of loneliness pressing so hard it felt permanent. Now as Ranger bounded after a thrown stick and returned with practiced precision, tail wagging proudly, John felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Neighbors continued to stop by often. Children knelt in the grass to pet Ranger, who accepted their affection with calm patience. Veterans from the community group called to invite John to gatherings, and sometimes he even said yes. The man who once lived on the edge of town in solitude now carried connections, not because he sought them out, but because one dog had pulled him back into the world. On one quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John sat on the porch with Ranger stretched out at his feet. The cicadas sang their steady song, and the air was warm with the smell of blooming magnolias. John leaned down, speaking softly. "You know, if someone had told me last year that a broken-down shepherd would show up at my door and turn my whole life around, I'd have laughed them off." He scratched behind Ranger's ears. "But here we are, two busted souls who somehow found each other." Ranger let out a deep sigh, his body relaxing fully, eyes closing in contentment. The simple trust in that gesture was enough to bring a lump to John's throat. The storms hadn't disappeared, neither the ones outside nor the ones inside, but they no longer felt unbearable. On nights when thunder rolled, Ranger pressed close until the tremors passed. On days when old memories threatened to swallow John whole, a wet nose nudged his hand, grounding him in the present. Healing hadn't come as a sudden miracle, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of shared survival. Dr. Emily, during their last vet checkup, had said it best. He's not just healthy again, he's thriving, and so are you. John hadn't known how to answer then, but sitting now in the fading light he understood. They were thriving, not because life had become easy, but because they faced it together. He thought back to Ranger's past, the years of service, the abandonment that followed, and he thought of his own, the uniform he had laid down, the ghosts that haunted him after. Both had been left behind in different ways, discarded when they were no longer seen as useful. But together, they had proven that worth wasn't measured by who remembered you, but by who stood beside you when the world grew heavy. The first night Ranger collapsed on his porch, John had whispered, "You'll make it through the night." Now, looking at the strong, loyal shepherd beside him, he knew the truth. They had both made it through much more than that. As fireflies began to flicker in the dusk, John spoke one last time, his voice steady, filled with gratitude. "We didn't just survive, Ranger. We found a life worth living again." The shepherd lifted his head, ears twitching, and pressed closer against his leg. And in that quiet moment, John realized that the greatest rescue hadn't been his saving Ranger, but Ranger saving him. Before we close this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful journeys of resilience, loyalty, and hope. And if you want to keep this feeling going, click the video on your screen now for another story that will move you just as deeply.